operation here? Operation Snatch. Exactly, Operation Snatch.
Hello, and welcome to Crime Squad Podcast presents Command and Controversy, the rise and fall of the Canadian Airborne Regiment. I'm Natasha, and I am the researcher, writer, and narrator of this podcast series. If you enjoy the way I present information, liking and subscribing to my podcast would be an amazing way to ensure the show gets out there to more listeners. Command and Controversy is a limited series investigative podcast that tells the true story of the Canadian Airborne Regiment, its creation, its celebrated status, and the shocking events that led to its disgrace and disbandment. Across 4 episodes, we trace the roots of a scandal that spanned continents, exploring covert drug trials that destabilized soldiers, cover-ups at the highest levels, and the brutal death of Shadain Aron, a Somali civilian, at the hands of Canadian peacekeepers. Drawing from declassified documents, archived newspaper articles and interviews, and the official inquiry that tried to contain the fallout, this series asks, what happens when a military unit turns on its mission and its morals? This is not just a story of a regiment. It's a story of accountability, silence, and the long shadow of a war crime Canada tried to forget. I need to warn you, this series is going to have themes of violence, abuse, torture, racism, and death, including murder and suicide. Take good care while listening. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. During World War II, Canada's military formed 2 units, the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion and the 1st Canadian Special Service Battalion. At the end of the war, in 1947, these units were no longer required, but instead of being disbanded, a new company was created. The core of this new unit were former members of the wartime parachute and special service units. The unit had many names, but in 1968, it was officially labeled as the Canadian Airborne Regiment. The Cold War was in full swing, and Canada, not unlike many NATO allies, felt the pressure to modernize their military forces. The biggest gap in the existing Canadian military was preparedness. Unlike its U.S. counterparts, Canada lacked the ability to respond quickly and deploy anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. So, what was the answer? A highly mobile, self-contained unit of paratroopers that could parachute into crisis zones at a moment's notice to be known as an elite strike force. The best of the best of the best. Military leaders sought to model this unit after other elite forces, such as the Green Berets in the United States, the Paras of England, and the French Foreign Legion. And so the Canadian Airborne Regiment was born. Its formation was seen as a bold step forward. The regiment was to be a symbol of strength and readiness, areas where the Canadian military had been lacking. Its creation, however, wasn't just strategic. It was politics, projection, and of course, prestige. Initially, the vision was that this regiment would be used to acquire young infantry soldiers up for promotion to officers. It was supposed to be a short stint for most, maximum 2 years. It evolved, however, into a highly specialized parachute force, and as such, members were encouraged to stay in the unit for as long as possible. The prestige came in part from the fact that nobody joined the Airborne directly. Soldiers were transferred in, if believed a good fit, from the Army's 3 existing infantry regiments. The Canadian Airborne Regiment was originally headquartered at Canadian Forces Base Edmonton and would soon become well known for its iconic maroon berets and cap badges. So, a brief summary of Canadian military insignia. In Canadian military order, Each regiment has their own set of badges, colors, and history. The Canadian Airborne Regiment wore maroon berets as their distinguishing color. A cap badge is sort of like a logo, which is designed with utmost consideration. The badge must be sewn or attached to the beret, which is an important part of standard uniform. Something soldiers are held to, with inspections occurring regularly to make sure each soldier is properly dressed in the official insignia. The Canadian Airborne Regiment insignia was designed to be an open parachute between two vertical wings with shroud lines from a cloud, which rests between the bases of the wings. There is a single large maple leaf flanked by two smaller maple leaves, and a scroll along the bottom has the words Airborne Canada Aeroport. The regimental motto comes from Latin ex coelis, meaning from the clouds. On paper, the regiment was the sharp edge of the Canadian military. But from the beginning, the culture forming inside was different. It was more aggressive, with the members considering themselves to be superior to other units. Many of them were known to sport tough guy attitudes. This wasn't just another infantry battalion. No, the men selected for the airborne saw themselves as elite and, in many cases, above reproach. Discipline was tight. You were expected to perform and perform well. The morale, however, was another story. What started as a disciplined elite fighting unit very quickly revealed another side, one that clashed entirely with these very values. The first major red flag occurred 6 years after the official formation of the regiment. In 1974, the Airborne was deployed to Cyprus as part of a UN peacekeeping mission. During the mission, a group of paratroopers from the regiment openly defied their commanding officers. They refused orders and challenged authority. This is unheard of in military regulations. There is a specific chain of command that is to be followed. For some reason, however, this mutiny was quietly swept under the rug. Nobody was reprimanded. Nobody was court-martialed. In fact, the regiment earned universal acclaim from their efforts in Cyprus. Thus began the formation of a very clear message. The Airborne was different. The Airborne was untouchable. In 1977, the regiment moved from its home base in Edmonton to Petawawa, Ontario. The base in Petawawa was more isolated, and this could perhaps be considered a main contributor to the bad behavior that soon followed. In 1979, just 2 years after the move to Petawawa, 2 airborne privates assaulted and robbed an Ottawa cab driver. In 1984, a number of incidents caused then Brigadier General R.I. Stewart to issue a memo that stated, quote, "The problem, in a nutshell, is that we have far too many cases of ill-disciplined behavior, assault, disobedience, disrespectful behavior, theft of public and personal property by soldiers, impaired driving offenses, vehicle accidents, inadequate control of stores, ammunition, pyrotechnics, weapons, and equipment that result in theft, and a general laxness in properly controlling soldiers, all of which contribute to erosion of disciplined soldierly behavior," end quote. Despite this, and a later attempt to gain control again with strict discipline within the regiment, the violence did not stop. In 1985, an airborne soldier killed a man with a machete, fatally wounding him with a slash to his neck. The soldier wounded another man in a bar fight in Quebec. In 1989, 6 members of the Airborne concealed themselves with hoods and masks and went into the barracks of another soldier. They beat him mercilessly. It was also in the 1980s that reports began surfacing about initiation rites for new soldiers brought into the unit. Initiation was prohibited according to the Airborne Indoctrination Course and illegal as documented in the National Defense Act. And again, despite the reports and investigation, the results of which showed that absolutely officers and senior non-commissioned officers knew these initiation parties were occurring, not a thing happened. There were no charges laid, and there were no orders to cease this activity. In 1986, a commanding officer of the Airborne documented the first instance of concern regarding the, quote, Rambo attitude of the troops, and revealed some of the men had been flying the U.S. Confederate flag. A Canadian soldier paying homage to a U.S. rebel flag was a major red flag. In fact, the commanding officer believed it was a challenge to the chain of command and felt the Airborne was going down a bad path, and quickly. The flag represented all of the things that were unacceptable in a Canadian military environment. The Confederate flag promotes attacks on authority, a lack of discipline, and has been used historically as a symbol of racism. A secret military report completed in 1991 warned of an increasing number of Canadian forces becoming associated with neo-Nazi organizations, such as skinheads, who promoted extremism and racist ideology. It was such an issue at this time that a special security unit was created, which was called the Security Intelligence Reporting on Skinheads. This unit found that 5 members of the Airborne were closely linked to Canadian fascist groups, and yet members within the Airborne were not reprimanded or asked to answer for this association. One such member was Corporal Matt McKay, who in the late 80s and early 90s had apparently recruited for the Ku Klux Klan and had connections to other neo-Nazi groups. Apparently, everyone who knew McKay knew he was, quote, a hardcore racist. There was photographic and new video evidence as well that seemed to confirm McKay's beliefs. In a photograph published by a news outlet, McKay stood against a backdrop consisting of a swastika and donned a shirt with an image of Adolf Hitler on it. He was pictured doing the Nazi salute.
Corporal Matt McKay, a self-confessed white supremacist who said he'd quit the neo-Nazi movement at least 2 years before this video was taken.
Corporal McKay, what do you think about the tour? I think it sucks, man. We ain't killed enough yet.
David Brocklebank was another member of the unit that reportedly held racist viewpoints. Footage of Brocklebank revealed him uttering racist and violent remarks. Was the Airborne different from other units of similar size in terms of the illegal activity and racism? Apparently not. However, other such units would not be brought to the limelight like the Canadian Airborne Regiment would. Several concerning incidents were documented, including platoon commander Captain Jonathan Faraby's private vehicle being set on fire and vandalized. No one within the Airborne was charged. Commanding officers of the unit came and went in short succession, with each attempting to conduct cleanup activities to rid the regiment of its dangerous key players. It was suggested by Colonel Walter Holmes, who commanded the regiment between 1990 and 1992, that in part the issue of the regiment's disciplinary concerns was linked to the fact that they had not been chosen to deploy since 1974 when they went to Cyprus. The Airborne Regiment hadn't been sent as part of the Oka crisis or the Gulf War. They were hungry for action. In 1992, the regiment was handed over to Lieutenant Colonel Paul Murnau, who did not have experience commanding a unit the size of the Airborne. His lack of experience later prompted a higher-ranked officer, Brigadier General Ernest Benno, to report to his superior that Murnau did not have a handle on the regiment. This truth was fully realized after a number of incidents. And just 1 month after Murnau assumed command, the UN announced it would require members of the UN forces to attend Somalia due to civil unrest and the overthrow of Siad Barre, who held a dictatorship in that country for over 20 years. The Canadian Airborne Regiment fit the bill for the job, and they were advised they would be deploying overseas. The Canadian Airborne Regiment felt they were long overdue for overseas deployment, and training for Somalia began quickly. It was nothing new for the airborne, and if anything, a clear validation that something was rotten in the unit when a group of paratroopers decided to celebrate the end of a training exercise by getting extremely inebriated and setting off pyrotechnic weapons on base at Petawawa. The party continued into the night with illegal discharges of explosive devices and gunfire. Someone, or multiple individuals, decided to set a sergeant's personal vehicle ablaze. Nobody was held accountable for these incidents, and yet another disturbing and telling incident occurred during a readiness exercise in preparing for deployment to Somalia. Both airborne and non-airborne soldiers participated in this 4-day exercise. Spoiler alert, the non-airborne troops complained that the regiment members promoted the abuse of mock prisoners and were also noted as deferring to deadly force with their weapons too abruptly, without leaving room for other de-escalation techniques. Brigadier General Beno didn't like what he was seeing and hearing, and he decided to utilize the chain of command and remove Morneau as the regiment's commander, just weeks before the Canadian soldiers were supposed to deploy. Morneau was replaced by Colonel Carol Mathieu, known to be a tough, no-nonsense soldier. He ramped up training to ensure the tour in Somalia was still a go. His plan? He was quoted as telling reporters that in Somalia, he would ensure things were quiet by being, quote, the meanest warlord on the hill. Mathieu's involvement meant the Airborne Regiment would still be deployed as part of the UN peacekeeping mission in Somalia. It was an important move. Canada has a reputation for always participating in international peace efforts. Canada's contribution to Somalia would therefore be approximately 1,200 members of the Canadian Armed Forces, and the entire Canadian Airborne Regiment would be deployed for the first time since 1974. This mission would set a chain of events that would include torture, murder, suicide, scandal, and devastation. Among the troops was Master Corporal Clayton Matchie. Clayton grew up in Meadow Lake in northern Saskatchewan and was proud of his Indigenous heritage. His family were members of the Cree of the Flying Dust First Nation. Clayton was just 17 years old when he enlisted in the Canadian military, and it was in 1988, at the age of 23, he earned his way into the ranks of the Canadian Airborne Regiment. The regiment had an aggressive, macho edge that most soldiers wanted to be a part of, and Clayton was no different. He did suffer greatly during initiation into the unit and would call his father in times of desperation when he wanted to quit. Clayton was targeted above and beyond other soldiers because of his Indigenous heritage. The soldiers called him racist names and gave him the nickname Geronimo. Clayton's father encouraged him to just keep going, and keep going he did. Clayton was 27 years old when he was set to go to Somalia. He had a wife and daughter, and the couple were expecting their second child. In a letter he penned to his father as he was getting ready to fly out, Clayton included a picture of himself beside a Confederate flag. His father did not understand what the flag meant or what it stood for. Just before Clayton was set to deploy, he and his family were interviewed by a journalist. His 6-year-old daughter was proudly quoted as saying, of her father, "He's going to be a peacekeeper." This would not be further from the truth. The troops were finishing their preparedness activities in late 1992 and were approved for deployment in late December. Before they left Canada, all the boxes needed to be ticked. There were bags to be packed, physical examinations to be completed, and, of course, inoculations. Traveling overseas would mean a new environment and exposure to diseases they hadn't been exposed to before. Members of the Canadian Airborne Regiment were provided an anti-malarial drug called mefloquine. What they did not know was that they were taking an unlicensed pharmaceutical, and one that was known to have adverse side effects. This experimental drug trial, okayed by the Department of Defense, was not made clear to Canadian troops, and it would have severe implications, which we'll explore in episode 4. Finally, they were ready. December 1992. Canadian peacekeepers are deployed to Somalia, a war-torn country on the brink of collapse. Among them, the Canadian Airborne Regiment, an elite, disciplined, and battle-ready crew. Or were they? What followed would become one of the darkest chapters in Canadian military history. A brutal killing, a widespread cover-up, and a national reckoning that reached the highest levels of power.
It was a bittersweet moment last December when Canadian soldiers said goodbye to their families and prepared to leave for Somalia. No one would have guessed that 3 months later, 5 of them would be under investigation for a murder half a world away.
It was a political decision as much as a military one, and it would cost lives, including Canada's international reputation. In the next episode of Command and Controversy, we take you inside the dusty compound in Somalia, where atrocities committed shattered public trust and forced an entire nation to ask, who are we when no one is watching? Command and Controversy is a limited series investigative podcast that tells the true story of the Canadian Airborne Regiment, its creation, its celebrated status, and the shocking events that led to its disgrace and disbandment. This has been episode 1 of this series, called Trigger Points, Politics, Power, and Canada's Military Elite. Stay tuned for episode 2, The Somalia Affair, a National Disgrace.